This is the IEEE Computer Society Distinguished Lecturer Webinar Series, brought to you by the Distinguished Visitors Program. The Distinguished Visitors Program delivers tools for individuals at all stages of their professional careers through visits to chapters, offering opportunities for individual interactions, and to the membership through webinars by respected professionals. We have distinguished visitors who cover machine learning, cybersecurity, robotics, big data, cloud computing, blockchain, and cryptography, among others. Chapters can request a distinguished visitor on computer.org/distinguished-visitors. The Computer Society pays all intercity travel, while chapters are responsible for all costs with regard to the hosting of the distinguished visitor, such as lodging, transportation, and food and incidentals in the city of the presentation. The Distinguished Visitors Program is able to pay up to $1,000 for a visit to a chapter, but by working with other nearby chapters to develop a tour, that amount can be increased. So when your chapter is planning its next event, think of the Distinguished Visitors Program. Welcome, everyone, to the Distinguished Lecturer Webinar Series. My name is Carrie Cosby, and I'm the Chapters Manager at the IEEE Computer Society, and I oversee our more than 500 professional student chapters around the world and manage our Distinguished Visitors Program. I'd like to take care of some housekeeping tasks. You can ask your questions in the Q&A panel. Dr. Greer will answer as many questions as he can following the presentation. When you're writing your questions, if it's relating to a particular slide, please do reference that slide if you can. The webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be available made available after the webinar. Today's discussion is writing for professional publications and using them effectively. I'd like to introduce our speaker. David Allen Greer has spent much of the past decade helping the IEEE Computer Society develop new electronic products, editing its periodicals, and writing for its members. He has served as editor-in-chief for the IEEE Annals of the History of Computing, as chair of the Magazine Operations Committee, and as editorial board member of Computer. Outside the society, he works as an associate professor of science and technology policy at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., with a particular interest in policy regarding digital technology and professional societies. There, Dr. Greer has worked as a university administrator for the past 20 years and has demonstrated a capacity for organizational management. He served as leader of the undergraduate computer systems degree, director of the university honors program, assistant dean of engineering, and associate dean of international affairs. Dr. Greer has worked extensively within the computer industry. He started as a programmer and systems designer for the Old Burroughs Corporation. He's also worked extensively as a consultant in the field. Dr. Greer, I'd like to pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Carrie, and welcome everyone to this lecture. Thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased to be here, and as we have said, my talk today is going to be on writing for professional publications, particularly the IEEE publications, and how to use them effectively. As Carrie said in his introduction, I have largely made my career in the publication world. I have done a lot of writing for them. I have been an editorial board member of Computer for nearly 20 years. And one thing he did not mention, and it's probably because I didn't write it down, is I've also served as editor-in-chief of Computer, which was one of my favorite jobs in the Computer Society. Writing for publication and getting things out for publication is a tricky task, and we build up a lot of myths around them. And my goal today is to get rid of some of those myths, help you think better about what you're trying to write for publication, about where you think you want to publish it, and how you get it published. And that often involves thinking much more broadly about your work and what you're doing in your work. So here's going to be our outline for today. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of publication, And I want to talk for a bit of publication as a dialogue, because in my role of having been editor-in-chief, particularly of Computer, I discovered the extent to which writing is not writing an article and posting it and saying, everyone, this is what I've done. To use it effectively, to make it a real tool to advance yourself and to advance your career, you want to think of it as a dialogue with the field and with the editors and editorial boards and readers in that field. And you want to think about how you engage that dialogue in a way that not only gets your ideas out, but pushes the field further. Next, we're going to talk about modes of publication, because in this day and age, there are many, many ways of publishing your ideas. And I'm aware that some of them are viewed as more important or impactful than others. But the important part is choosing one that brings your idea most clearly to the fore. And then I'm going to do a little bit on practical aspects of writing and some of the ways you want to think about presenting your ideas in a very practical, down-to-earth, what sentences, how you get the ideas in, how you present it. Now, I need to say this talk today is part of a course that I regularly teach that is really less about writing and is a little bit more about research and presentation coaching. It's a course that's designed to help people, young researchers, get articles published in scholarly journals, and new business leaders get their proposals, their ideas, their presentations done in a way that makes sense in their community. So this is a short version, and shall we begin? In my role as editor-in-chief, which I've done for a long, long time in the Computer Society, one of the things I have discovered is that ideas can be isolated, and publication brings them out of isolation. Time and time again, when I was editor of Computer, I would get an article from an author that says, this is an idea, here's my manuscript, publish it. And of course, there's the refereeing process, but there's a bigger process of trying to make that idea fit in to the body of knowledge that we're presenting. How does this idea fit into what we know and what we're talking about and we're thinking about? That's really a key question that every author has to answer, and editors are often good people to help them answer it. The next question that every author has to answer is, why should we care? And I can tell you that that alone is one of the most important questions. Because if you have a great idea and you say, this is my idea, and you ask, why should we care? And you say, it's just a great idea. Publication space is limited. The time and effort we have to get things into publication is limited. And unless we see something that says this is building the field, this is helping us advance, may not get to the front of the queue. And that is related to a key question: what problem does it solve? That question seems to be obvious, but it actually requires a little bit of work and a little bit of effort. I can give lots of examples. I need to be careful about giving them. It doesn't tip things away for authors that I've worked with. But I was once an editor-in-chief, and we got an article on machine learning. And I looked at it and I said, this isn't necessarily a new idea. How are we going to work with it? And I did a little bit of research and found very quickly that it was a rediscovery of an idea from the 1980s. And that idea was used to simplify neural networks and machine learning. And the author sent it to me that said, well, if we introduce this complexity, we get something else. And I got in a correspondence with him. And those three questions were ones that were difficult for him to answer. He did not know that others had done work and got a little defensive about it. It's something we need to be a little bit careful of when we're both editors and authors. We have a lot of people doing a lot of research, and people are often tackling problems that are similar to the ones we have. And finding out what that work is and getting our work in line with it is sometimes a little bit tricky and a little touchy. The why should I care? That's, in this case, was related to the problem it was solving. And the 1980s research was trying to simplify the problem and make it all linear. And the author I was dealing with saying, let's introduce some complexity and make it all nonlinear. Well, we understand linearity, and that means there's a body of knowledge out there that we're trying to talk with, and researchers and practitioners we're trying to talk with. Does the complexity help? We ended up going back and forth, and I finally said, ultimately, this is not going to be a paper for computer. Computer readers are looking for things that present solutions and move them into the existing community. And you're trying to talk to the machine intelligence community and get them to go a different way. So this really needs to go to a machine intelligence journal. And that was the discussion. And it was not a discussion that reflected on the quality of the work. It was what was trying to be done with publication and what the author was attempting to do and what would have been a better task for the author to do. And I do believe the paper got published elsewhere, which was what it should have done. So that's the kind of work that we do. And we do this now. We have to think sort of about the modes and the process. As I said, I have been associated with computer for 15 years now, actually a little bit longer in theory. But I've been active on the editorial board and active as the editor-in-chief. And that's the world I know best. And for me, that's a very important world. And the Computer Society has a very rich collection of magazines, a lot of material. As a whole, these publications are looking for articles that represent what's going on in the field right now and help readers who are less familiar with that field advance in. All of it is new, all of it's refereed, but at the same time, it's educating the community as a whole. And that's an important task, and these magazines have done it. Computer is now 60 plus years old for a long, long time, and they've been highly influential. In fact, right now, one of the things I'm doing for Computer is writing a column about the kind of influence that it has had over the years. Journals, on the other hand, are quite different, and they are generally looking at a narrower field. Now, often people think, well, I want impact, so I want the biggest field possible. And that's not always the right way to begin. If publication is a dialogue, you want to be talking to the people that can most use your ideas and and build the best on your articles. And in a lot of fields, it's the scholarly journal community. That's a tighter group. They have a common understanding of the problem, a common understanding of where the state of the field is, and they can both use your ideas and help you advance it in new ways. So when you're thinking about the different modes, that's an important one that's quite different from the magazines that, as I said, have been the mainstay of my career. Conferences are an interesting thing, and they have an unusual role in the IEEE and in computer science writ large, in that they have often seen the first look at many ideas, and often now conferences are being augmented by open access and free access journals. And these are important in getting out ideas fast and quickly. Speed has its advantages and its drawbacks, and it means the conversation is often happening as the idea is developing. During my time as Computer Society president, I attended a lot of conferences, regional conferences, international conferences, conferences that I often knew, only the most superficial sense of the results of the current time. And as I went to them, I began to appreciate how much they are really fairly tight communities. Communities often centered on 60, 80, 100. Big conferences can be centered on about 250. And that central core defines what they're doing, what they're interested in, what methods they're using, and what questions they're asking. And by working in that community, you often get very strong feedback. You get a lot of interaction about what you're doing and how you can add to the work as a whole. It does mean sometimes that you need to focus on them and start ignoring things outside of that group. And that takes some doing. It takes a little discipline, and it takes a little bit of understanding who your audience is. At this point, I really do want to remind you that one of the theses of this talk is conversation. What we're doing here is we're doing publication as a dialogue. Publication is a conversation with your peers, and it's looking at a long-term trends of accumulated results, ideas that link to each other. And in many ways, in this engineering, the technical, the scholarly world, this process has been going on since the late 17th century, since the Royal Society began publishing its proceedings. The idea behind their proceedings was they originally wanted everyone to come to London to talk about their research. In fact, that proved to be impracticable. So they started publishing a journal so that people outside of London could see what was going on. Now, we all have a professional community, whether we're researchers, whether we're academics, whether we are engineers working in industry, whether we're consultants like me. There are people that know what kind of work we do. They know the kind of tools we use in it, and they know the kind of results that we will get, and hence the kind of questions. These people have a common interest that allows them to work together, and they often have a common background and common training. Now, that's not necessarily true. You know, I've moved through a large part of computer science because I have a mathematical background that has allowed me to grasp many, many parts that I didn't study as an undergrad or as a graduate student. But they end up having a common training, a common language, and a common set of concepts that allows them to share ideas and to talk to each other. One of the interesting bits, particularly I saw this in the conferences, was the commitment they have to answering certain kinds of questions. And sometimes this commitment means that they're working in fields that will have a certain arc to them. In particular, there was a period, particularly during my undergraduate days, that I was very interested in symbolic artificial intelligence, and I followed a great deal of the work in that. It's a kind of artificial intelligence that is less active now as a research community. The knowledge engineering community grew out of it, but it is now dealing with certain commercial problems that I largely didn't see. And it means that the process has changed. And as you think about your publication, as the work that you're doing, you want to ask that question sometimes. Where is the field? Where is my community? What are they thinking about? How can I reach it? And where is it going? Is it something that I really need to think about finding a new community? Well, what's your challenge here? You've got an idea. You think it's a good idea. You think it has value. You think it solves some kind of problems, and that there are methods that are important in solving those problems. And that's really one of the key issues about publication. In particular, I saw this in computer, again, a lot. People would say, look, I've solved this kind of problem. This is wonderful. I've built this system. I've written this software. And I would often be forced to write back going, tell us about your tools. The result is often just a way to get us started. We want to learn what's behind it, what's going to help us advance our work. How can we duplicate what you've done? And how do we produce the kind of result that you do? Publications strive to do that. Sometimes they struggle to do it, but that's what they do. And in particular, one of the key bits is this last line here. How does it open new kinds of questions? How does your work allow us to approach ideas, problems, issues in a new way and use that to solve new kinds of problems and advance the field further? Well, as always, this conversation is kind of a cycle, and so much of computer science is a cycle. We start with a problem, we get methods, we get a solution, we publish it, and then we see the open issues, the weaknesses, the new paths that are open to us, which leads to new problems, which leads us to develop new methods. It's important to consider yourself as part of that. There are, I want to say, myths of papers that radically changed fields, of papers that closed fields, of papers that changed industry. There is some truth about that. There have been very influential papers. And right now, my column in Computer, I like to say I've written the same column for 15 years. It's just had different subjects. Right now, I'm looking at that question, looking at the articles that seem to change a field. And what I'm finding is surprising, that not one of them stands by themselves. For example, I just wrote a column earlier this year on Barry Boehm's seminal work in software engineering in the 1980s. And his work is very important. It has largely been displaced by Agile, but at the same time, his informs Agile, and his grows out of structured programming. And so it's very difficult to say this paper, which is listed as the 7th most influential paper Computer has ever published, stands by itself. It changed the field. It led for great changes that have led to Agile, to extreme programming, to all of the things that come along with it. And yet it doesn't stand by itself. It is part of a cycle and part of a conversation. So let us kind of look at the forms of what we need to do. What opportunities are out there for you as a prospective author? Well, as I've said, the very first question that you need to ask is, why should I care? Now, we know why you as a prospective author should care. You want to get published. You want to see your work out there. You want to be part of the conversation. But why should others care? And when I teach students, in particular, this class is primarily geared towards young professionals and senior PhD students, I sit down and ask that question, and I have, at this stage, I'm not surprised. I'm ready for a long conversation with the students, going back and forth over what they think they've accomplished and not really thinking of what it accomplishes for somebody else. What does it accomplish for somebody outside in the field? Well, as you start to answer that question, the real thing is, what's in it for the reader? Why should someone take the time to look at it, to spend time reading it? And when you're dealing with technical publication, there is a time you have to spend mastering it. Very few can be read quickly. Most require a certain concentration, a certain orienting yourself in it. And that means that you have to make a substantial commitment to it as a reader. Why should the reader bother with your article? It's important for you to know that, because that's going to shape everything that you write and how you develop your idea. And finally, what's important? What is going to stand out as an idea that the reader will take with them and move forward? I can look at, and I've been a little surprised by this, I can look at many articles that have been important to me over my career. And I'm an inveterate reader of the computer science literature. Time and again, I have been surprised that a point that I took from an article was not really the main point of it. There was a period, for example, that I was very active in designing floating point systems for machines. It was my closest approach to hardware. And I remember this day an article that was vital in that work. And I stumbled across a copy of it, a PDF, recently, and I was surprised to see that it was not on floating point systems at all. It was on a very different subject, and that I took a key idea from it that was important to me. Now, in doing this, bad writing, articles that don't get published, articles that authors look at and get confused with, answers the wrong questions. They tend to focus you as author rather than focus on the community. Do you know what I am doing is the common thing. And again, as editor for Computer, I would get articles, I would read them, and I would send them back saying, we're not prepared to even review this article until you get it in something that's audience-centric. Because all you're writing right now is saying, I am doing this. You aren't telling us why it's important. You aren't telling us that it's helping evolve the field. It's not giving us tools that we can use. The ones that I must admit are kind of the most challenging, have been over the years for me to deal with, is the article that says, do you know that you're wrong? And I can point to dozens of them. And we have published articles in computer science that are incomplete, that don't quite get the solution right. But going after them makes the discussion, makes the conversation look personal, makes it look like a vendetta. And when you go off on that, and rather than saying, let me advance the field, you're often getting a readership that gets defensive from the start, that becomes unwilling to go through your article. I can remember very clearly a talk that I saw at a conference now, probably 20 years ago, maybe even a little longer than that. And it was a Don't You Know You're All Wrong article by an author who's well known and very bright and has done a lot of things for the field of computer science. And I sat through that conference, and the guy was so aggressive that one by one, the audience left. Didn't quite get down to zero. I stayed to the end. And so did a few others. And he turned around at the end and said, well, they're just not up for following me. And the answer was no. They were just tired of listening to him harangue about the others. The simple idea was good. It did correct mistakes. It did move things on, but they weren't willing to sit through that. The other variation of that, which happens far too often, are the articles that say, don't you know that I'm brilliant? It takes a lot of work to be a good computer scientist, a good engineer, a good CTO. It doesn't advance your idea if that is the point you're trying to make in your article. So let's now move from that and start getting into some practical stuff. In terms of your presentation and making your point, making what you've got out there, there are four major elements that all come from the PhD, but are useful for anyone. In a PhD, I know some of you have them, some of you don't. This is fine. One of the things you have to do is very formally contextualize your work. You then state your problem. You then state the solution to it, and you then give an assessment for it. Those four things. And a PhD dissertation is a very ritualized, very formal way of doing that, so that your advisors and your committee can guide you into doing it well. They make you do the literature search to excruciating detail, and there's a reason for that. One of the reasons is, particularly in computer science, but in any field, problems are spread across a wide variety of disciplines, and people approach it in different ways. Again, going back to my experience of attending a lot of conferences in 1 year, I saw many people more or less tackling the same kind of problems with very different tools and were completely unaware of what others were doing. That taught me that, in effect, the idea that people's work is not duplicated is a mistake, is a myth. But it also told me that there's a lot to be gained by trying to read the computer literature broadly and trying to pick up new ideas out of it. So it's always good to know what is out there. You know, for example, I'm in the middle of a book that I'm working on right now. And there is a paper that I've been looking for that argues in software engineering that the architecture of your software is going to be identical to the division of labor of your programmers and developers. And I went looking for that in the software engineering literature, and I said, I know I've read this. I know it's important to my work. It's important to this book that I'm working on. Where is it? It's in the business management literature. It's called Conway's thesis. And it's not quite about software, but it's clearly close enough that you can say, ah, this is it. And when I found it, I then remembered how I got it, who told me about it, and how I worked with it. And that's a vital, important thing. Look broadly. The problem statement is a narrower aspect because you want a problem that people can understand. You want to phrase it in ways that others can do it. Time and again, as editor-in-chief, as a teacher, I've talked to people and said, who's going to understand what you're doing? And they would say, no one understands it because what I'm doing is unique. If what you're doing is unique, that's a problem. because you need to use the words and concepts and ideas that others are doing. And so when you write your statement, you have to think about your audience and you have to say, how will they understand? This is easiest to do for conferences because, as I said, conferences are generally run and managed by a fairly small group that rotate through the jobs. And hence, by looking at the last 4 years of proceedings, you'll get a real clear sense of how questions are framed, what kind of questions they're looking for, how you describe them, and how you answer them. The solution is usually dependent upon the problem statement. It has to answer the problem. You can't posit one question and not quite answer it, or answer another, or drift around. Again, getting papers that have that problem are very common in magazines, but I've served on enough editorial boards and refereed enough papers for transactions in scholarly journals to know the problem is there. They'll say, this is my problem, and then they'll go off and answer some other problem. The assessment is the last bit, and it's sort of the hardest thing that people have to come to grips with because it sounds like self-criticism, and it's not. At the end of your paper, you have a conclusion, and the conclusion is more or less the same thing as the introduction. In the introduction, you say, this is the problem I'm going to solve, and I'm going to solve it this way with this kind of result. And in the conclusion, you say exactly the same thing. I said I was going to solve this sort of problem with these sorts of tools, and I did. But the conclusion needs to go a couple steps further. Steps are these. And the next steps are really usually two things. One, it's saying that your solution didn't cover some interesting issues, and someone needs to look into that. That's very common. No one can do all the work themselves. At some point, you have to say, I've got a result here, let me publish it. And here's some other applications. The other side of assessment is projecting what other kinds of problems could be solved. I have solved it for this class of problems. I think my ideas should be applicable to another set of problems, and others should consider going off into them. Those four elements should appear in any article you do. Now, they appear in different ways, but it's useful to remember that and have that in front of you as you go ahead. Oh. And my screen seems to be frozen, and I don't know if I'm talking to everyone. Okay, I think I'm back now.
Just letting you know, we all hear you, so you're fine.
Excellent. I am fine. Okay, and I am trying to push a slide out. And I'm not seeming to see it.
Overview and proceedings.
Okay, and the one that, 4 forms of publication, and I'm not seeing it. Nothing is moving on my screen. What's the slide you're seeing?
27 of 49, overview proceedings.
Okay. That sounds good. As I said, mine is frozen. Let me give an overview, because I have another version of it here, and I'm glad I did this. Overview proceedings. I've talked much about this. It's a fairly tight community. One of the things to know about it, as you're thinking of writing for it, is that knowledge evolves generationally. You tend to have sort of a 6 to 8 year generation, 6 to 10 year generation, where one set of authors will be publishing for roughly about that period of time, and they will move off after that period. This is, a fairly common aspect about publications, that the people who are interested in them have a finite time. And so when you're thinking about writing for it, that's one of the tasks that you need to remember, that there's a group of people who are there now. Your job is to take their ideas and move them forward. You're building on a set of ideas that have been published by that periodical over the last 7 to 10 years. The principal audience are close colleagues, and I need to ask am I up to slide 28 now?
I
Gary?
can move you there. Move you now.
Okay, slide 28. Our principal audience are close colleagues. There is minimal contextualization. You know what the problems are that you're talking about. You have a common language, a common set of tools, a common set of concepts. And what's detailed is the method and the solution, and it usually does a fair amount of speculation about future work. That's the kind of thing that you're thinking about when you're doing a proceedings. The speed that you have when you're working on proceedings is that writers of this tend to do multiple papers per year, that authors tend to think of the shelf life as being in months. And I can tell you right now that, for example, in the IEEE electronic library, they view that the proceedings papers have a shelf life of about 3 years, that they don't see a lot of downloading of papers after 3 years. And after 6 years, it virtually ceases except for papers that have established themselves as canonical. One of the interesting bits that you discover in being an editor-in-chief is that a great deal of interest is expressed in it during the refereeing process, and that almost everyone who is important, who will use this idea, will have read it within 6 or 8 or 10 weeks. So what is the so what question that you're trying to answer here? What are you trying to do? Why is this important? And it needs to move us up, I believe, to slide 29 here of the publications. The things that you're basically saying is that I'm a member of your community, and this is the direction that you're going. That's the kind of conversation you're trying to fit into. And that's the kind of thing that happens when you're publishing for proceedings. I'd like to get in just to a moment into the role of conferences. As I said, they're a type group, and I believe I'm on slide number 30 at the moment. And again, my screen is frozen. I ask your forbearance for this. Conferences in many ways are about community. They are what is often called an invisible college of people. They are the people who are really up to date on research. They are interested in what's going on. Right now, there's a great deal of effort on how do we get conferences tied into journals and conferences. In computer science, they once were the central role. That until about the 1980s, most of the major papers published in computer science were conference papers. This fractured in the 80s when we ceased to have a single major conference. Not all conferences are equal. But you should think about, when you think about proceedings, when you think about how you are publishing for conferences, that you're working in a tight community. You want to get to know that community, and it doesn't hurt you, and this is true about all publication, to reach out to them before you start submitting papers to them. Learn who they are, learn what you're doing, what they're doing, learn how you can fit in. On the next part, once you go from conferences, the next community is journals. Journals are not as tight. They don't necessarily know you, whereas in conferences, at the end of the conference, basically all the people who have been involved in it will have the opportunity to meet everyone who's there, and will have an opportunity to meet the inner core and to be part of that inner community. Journals don't know you. Journals, transactions. Most readers will see it during the review process. Again, in conferences, it's during that short little period that you're getting ready for the conference that your paper generates the most excitement and is the most widely read. Somewhere between 70 and 100% see journal papers during review. They have a longer cycle. Editors are appointed for 2 years with 2 years renewable. That's what the slide says. I've learned in the IEEE they've now been changing it with a 3-year appointment for the first and 2 years for the reappointment. But nonetheless, that means that their editorial board, that their interests will hold sway for about 5 years. And once you get a change of it, there's often a substantial change in the interest and topic of the journal and what they're publishing. This is a vital thing as you're thinking about publishing. In my work on journals, again, I have seen regularly people submit papers, the editorial board look at it and them say, this is not what we're doing now, and reject it. And then the author will get angry and will, this particularly hit me when I was vice president of publications, get in touch with the vice president of publications and say, how dare they do this? They used to publish articles like this. I have examples of what I have published. Periodicals change. And within the IEEE, and really within the whole field, the editor-in-chief is given exclusive authority for interpreting what the scope is and how that scope is applied. And so there tend to be this 4, 5, 6, 7-year cycle of interest in certain issues in certain fields that is the interest of the editorial board. Again, it is useful to reach out to the editorial board. These things are indeed more stable than conferences. There's more investment in them. And the papers that you present in them have a different purpose and are structured differently. And if I can go up to the next slide, please, Carrie. I believe it's slide 30, Overview Journal. The principal audiences are researchers for journals. There is a certain readership in the commercial world, but the principal things are researchers. The main features that journals have that proceedings don't is that there is more contextualization, and there's more things that talk about methodology, questions, and knowledge. So those things are part of aspects that you need to think about adding to them. Again, whenever you think about writing for a journal, sit back and read the last 5 or 6 issues of it. It'll tell you a great deal about what's out there and what you need to think about your writing. They have a much longer shelf life. They have longer things for fundamental ideas. And when you are writing an article, a good journal article, you're doing basically 1 or 2 a year if you don't have assistants. It takes that kind of work to do it well and to get it out. And we'll talk a little bit more about structure and form and how that's done just in a little bit. If you move up to the next slide, which is slide 32, the so what question is really trying to understand the state of the problem, understand what it is and where it's going. And there's an example I like to use that I've got an article coming out on soon. There is the AIEE, the American Institute for Electrical Engineering, published a paper by Claude Shannon in 1938 that is one of the most influential papers the IEEE has ever published in the field of computing. And what is interesting about it is that Shannon wasn't talking about computing because there weren't computers in 1938. He was talking about telephone switching networks. Telephone switching had been an important topic for about 15 years. Starting in 1923, we started to get switchable phones, phones that didn't have to go through a human operator. And switchable phones are at some level digital calculations. The digits in this case were pulses. They were binary on and off. And in thinking about where the field was in the technology, Shannon began to grasp the idea that there needed to be a language to describe these circuits, and that language was Boolean algebra. And his paper is, in effect, bringing Boolean algebra to the field and telling them, this is where our field is now. It needs a language to get forward, and this is where it is going to go. And over the course of 10 years following that paper, everything in telephone switching and in computing shifted to talking about things in terms of a logical context. Without that, we would not have had it. It took 10 years for the field to change. It did not present a radically new result, but it was a very clear understanding of where the field was and what it lacked to help it advance. So if you're thinking about, do I go to conference, journal, or journal? I think the standard belief is that journals are a second publication after a conference. You build up your repertoire as a conference author and then move on to journals. There's some truth, and I think that model works fairly well. But I think there are people who have done great work in conferences and in open access and the equivalent form for their entire career. And there are people who have started as journal authors and remained that. And conferences have a smaller, tighter community. They are much more focused on what's happening this month, this week, within a very tight 6-month period. The journals and transactions have deeper connections to the field and are really thinking about it in long term. They have very similar styles, though. Transactions tend to have a longer contextualization. With proceedings, with conferences, it's very short. Transactions have a longer and deeper review. And conferences, often the review is a group of people trying to read a bunch of papers in a very short period of time. Proceedings have one idea, rapid review, and off they go. If we move up to slide 34, you can build careers with both. Leadership tends to come out of a transaction. In my work in the society, I tended to see leaders who tended to be more transaction authors, who tended to build their career on what they had done for specific journals. We are in, of course, the age of open access transactions, and they are, quite different from the traditional transactions. One of the things to note is that open access means free to the reader. If you have been writing for them, you know that means that they're not necessarily free to the author, that most of them now have open access fees. And that is changing who gets to publish and is changing very clearly the nature of what that publication is. We're seeing things, particularly in Europe now, that suggest that there's going to be a lot of free publication in transactions, and that the division is likely going to be the reviewing process versus unreviewed, because unreviewed can be done fairly quickly and for free or very cheaply, whereas the review process is expensive. So as you do this, you in theory get more readers in open access. That remains to be proven. Certainly in computer science, the IEEE and the ACM electronic libraries have the dominant readers right now, with archive coming up a close third, but has been growing slowly. And archive, of course, is not open access. It's an open archive. I think there are going to be alternatives to conferences, particularly as we see the pandemic change the conference landscape. And they're going to be shaped, I think, without question, by the requirements of universities and publishers and universities and companies that will ask for them. If we move up, please, to slide 36, the magazine section. Again, this is it's more of an educational goal. It's an effort to try and make sure that knowledge is broadly spread. It is often talking to people who are outside of narrow technical fields. And so the so what question is the most important part, because you're often talking to people who don't completely understand the problem. And you are telling them why they should care about this field, about your work, and your problem. If we move further to slide 37, magazines are not that different from survey articles. In fact, as I've said in my work currently for Computer, the most influential articles Computer has ever published have been survey articles. Clearly out of the top 20, I would say well over half of them. And they are very much in flux because surveys are in flux, and there's a question of how do we educate professionals in fields they don't know and need to know. And we're seeing a great deal of thrashing about that. Magazines still have a role, but we are seeing ideas move to other media. And the one that I find most intriguing is the fact that podcasts are often now the ways that we do surveys. And I am going to be intrigued to see how that develops. If you look on Collaboratech, podcasts or videocasts seem to be the way that new ideas are being presented to broader audiences. They are particularly being used in business and that community. And that's a form of writing, but it's a different thing, and how we judge them and how we evaluate them. Well, I've been teaching largely in the abstract right here, and I'd like to spend the last, dozen slides or so dealing with some, hardcore writing stuff. I think it's useful to do this because I want to show that thinking about your writing in terms of the sentence and paragraph and paper structuring is related to this context and the ideas of the different kinds of publication. So if we can be on page 38 right now, we see an arc, and we see the fundamental rule of writing, which writing goes from the unfamiliar to the familiar. And that seems obvious, but I can tell you I have edited and refereed many, many papers that don't. You have to start where the reader is. You have to, as they say, get the hay down where the goats can get it. That means you start with a familiar idea, a statement of the problem, a statement of the context, a statement of the industry. You move to another idea. You begin to show how they are in conflict or how they produce an interesting problem. You resolve that problem, and then you come to a resolution at the little end of my arrow there. And let's illustrate this with the standard abstract. And I'm talking about abstracts here. I know they're mostly scholarly, but first off, every field needs to be able to summarize its ideas shortly. It also illustrates the writing process, and it does so in a way that I can do in the last 10 minutes of this talk. It's a simple storyline form. It's a linear structure. And it moves, again, from the familiar to the unfamiliar. And it has a resolution, and the best abstracts have to answer, so what? Because what an abstract does is it advertises the paper. It says, you should read this paper. And you should read this paper because it has an interesting insight to a problem, or because it gives you a new method, or because it gives you new results, or all three. But it has to make that case. And you are surprised at how few abstracts do in their first draft. There is a fairly common three-sentence form for abstracts, and you see that on my slide number 40. And that three-sentence form follows this arc, the familiar to the unfamiliar. The first sentence says, traditionally, we've done this. It makes a statement about what has been done before. Statement 2, sentence 2, brings the conflict. Recent research shows that there is a problem with that method, or something else that shows that the current state of affairs doesn't do everything that we would like. And the third sentence says, our research fixes this problem. We have a new result, or we have a new method, or we have a new way that develops new questions. Familiar, conflict, resolution, all very neatly done in 3 sentences. Now, as I've said, many abstracts, you kind of have to do 2 sentences for that first one, and the last one kind of needs to be perhaps a couple. But if you think of it as 3 parts, it works very nicely. And that structure applies again and again and again to many, many forms of writing. Well, let's look at a simple example, and I pull this out of my undergraduate instruction when I was teaching undergrads. We'll have a sample abstract, and we will try to ask what's wrong with it and what should we make it do. Abstract, it's on page 41, slide 41. Of the elementary algorithms, heap sort is regarded in the literature as most efficient. Recent research has shown that it can be badly inefficient when used with virtual memory. This paper identifies the circumstances that causes these inefficiencies and shows how to avoid them. 3 simple sentences. Okay, let's look at them step by step, and that involves moving to statement 42. Of the elementary algorithms, heap sort is regarded in the literature as most efficient. That is a statement of elementary algorithms in something that's taught in the 2nd course of computer science and has been since I was a child. And it's a statement of where things are. it sets us up for the next one. That is the criteria this paper is talking about. Efficiency, the greatest amount of work for a fixed amount of effort. So that talks with the familiar. If we move to 43, we get to the second one. Recent research has shown that it can be badly inefficient when it is used with virtual memory. And I'm stealing this from a paper that came out, probably 15 years ago, but showed that some of the memory management and caching and some of the other aspects played havoc with all sorts of standard algorithms. And you could really tie up the lessons of elementary computer science into knots if you didn't take into account some of the underlying architecture. But that second sentence in line 43, on slide 43, is the familiar idea, but puts it in conflict, and puts it in conflict on a specific term, efficiency. Well, we now need to resolve that, and if we go to slide 44, we will do that. This paper identifies the circumstances that cause these inefficiencies and shows how to avoid them. This is a paper primarily about method, identifies the circumstances, finds an area that needs to be addressed, and shows how to avoid them. That is the result, and that is the abstract. Now, I do this as an abstract, not necessarily because you need to do abstracts, but because this format is what happens in the paper as a whole, in conclusions, in introductions, when you're doing the survey of literature. You're trying to pull together things on a common theme. Familiar idea, second familiar idea that establishes the criteria, a conflict of showing how those two things interact, and a resolution. So let's move ourselves on one more slide and get back to sort of that standard abstract form, because it's a 3-sentence abstract of your research, or of your business, or of your product, or of your consulting firm. Known to unknown, set up a problem, end with a resolution, and say, why should I care? In the one I gave you, the why you should care is because you're concerned about efficiencies. We want to see efficient algorithms, and this shows you how to do it. Everything needs to have that kind of structure and that kind of form. So with that, let us move to slide number 46, and this is going to be my summary slide. Professional publications is part of a dialogue. You're talking with people in different forms, different structures, different ways. You're always building. When Claude Shannon said, we should use Boolean algebra as the fundamental tool of computer development, he was building on work of George Boole, which he wrote his 1855. And he was working on the work of Aristotle. So we're always building on others. And you are always trying to help others build on your work. And that's, I think, one of the great joys that I have seen in developing. I've had the ability to write in a lot of different, opportunity in a lot of different fields, and to contribute to a lot of different things. And in particular, I had one book that came out that proved to be the foundation of crowdsourcing. And I spent 3 or 4 years helping others develop ideas that built upon my book, and thinking a little bit of it would be fun to follow along, but it was really for them to do the work and for me to provide the opportunity. And there are clearly 3 different modes in the computer field: magazines, conferences, and transactions, that all have kind of different audiences, different time frames, different groups, but they all have to solve a problem. They all have to fit into a conversation. And they really all need to answer the question, why should the reader care? And I presented the standard abstract model as a basic part of the tools. When I work with students in a class, I spend a lot more time on these tools and we develop them in different forms. But right now and right here, that abstract illustrates all the basic things that you need to know about developing your article. And with that, I've been glad to be with you today. I'm David Allen Greer. I'm the past editor-in-chief of Computer, and I was president of the Computer Society and many other things. You can reach me at that email if I may be of use to you. And if I can answer some questions, I am here to do that.
Dr. Greer, thank you very much for your presentation. Sorry about the slight technical issues, but I think we did stick with you on the slides.
Thank you.
You're
the ones that are following, and thank you. Okay.
So some of these were very early on. You may have covered some of them, so we'll, if you find one that you've already covered, you can just let me know.
Okay.
This one says, regarding the familiar science slide, this reminds me of the famous OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act, repeat. I guess they just want you to speak on that.
Yeah, and the answer is because it is. That loop and that process, which is core to engineering and core to computer science, is core to publication as well, and is very much part of it. The origins of that loop, of course, come from Walter Schuhart's famous book on quality control in the 1930s. And I have a copy of the page where he has sketched out that little cycle. That's crucial. And when you're part of a dialogue, that is what you're doing. Right now, I'm in the middle of a monologue. And if I did this to you and you were in my presence, you would get bored and leave. I can get away with it only because we're doing a webinar. But these talks, these questions, in effect, help me be part of that. And that's what you need to be part of whenever you publish, whenever you present your ideas. You need to do, you need to listen, you need to act, you need to repeat.
Very good. This next question says, we'd like you to share your view of publishing as a dialectic process.
I can go on this for hours. I have loved publication. I have been involved in it because of the opportunity it provides for teaching everyone involved. For the author, the benefits are obvious. It helps you organize your thoughts, and in particular, when I teach classes on publication. As I said, I have this standard class that I'll go to the university, and I'll teach it to their PhD students, and I'll sit down with each one of them and talk to them and get them to answer these questions of so what? What's the context? What are my methods? Why should people care about it? And it sounds easy, but as you do it, as I've done this, I've discovered of getting them to do it is just a tremendous learning experience, and it's one that they are largely doing, and I'm largely just sitting here poking at them and trying to nudge them in a certain direction, and they're discovering. On the same time, having been a long-term editor, and my editorial work in the Computer Society goes back 25 years, I have learned so much by doing this. And I am a very broad computer scientist, not because I set out to do it that way, but because my work as an editor has taught me to do it and has exposed me to fields that I have not, and has made me ask, where does this come from? One of the jobs of an editor when you get articles is to ask, who else might be doing this and where are their connections? In part, you want to make sure you're not publishing well-known work. And that work has just pushed me deeply into the library, has pushed me beyond the Explore and ACM library into the math library, into the business management libraries. And that work has taught me about how much is going on, how central computing is to it, and how the solutions that we provide echo and repeat and presage solutions in other fields. And that has taught me to be a better researcher, a better thinker, a better organizer of my thoughts.
Thank you. I really like this next question. From an industry perspective, as I look to apply potential research or published knowledge into practice based on my review, I look for answers to three questions: what, why, and now what? You address the what and the why, but having the now what is also important. Can you provide some actionable next steps one can take to either learn more or apply into practice?
The now what is my assessment step? You are exactly right. And you can't write, particularly in industry and business, the now what is the downstream, what is happening next. And unlike what you do in academia, there is a whole range of now what, ranging from how do we get something into practice to how do we think about product development, 6 quarters out from now. Now what, the assessment is a step of an imagination. And that is, one of the things that we strive in engineering education to both develop and kill all at the same time. When I was a dean of engineering, we worked with these great kids who came with so many ideas and would play. They would play on computers, they would play with mechanical devices, they would wire up circuits and all sorts of things and have great fun letting their imaginations run. And we would discipline them into behaving like a modern engineer. But you have to have that imagination. What can come? What can we solve? What can we do? Sometimes the standard brainstorming of writing everything down is, every possible thing down and talking about it works. But sometimes, that's just lists that doesn't help you. It sometimes involves stretching your imagination, in thinking about different kinds of worlds, different kinds of outcomes, different kinds of people involved, and how they might react to it, what they might do with it, how a different industry would happen. And then backing off that imagination into the world in which you live and say, does that inform what I need to do to meet my goals by this quarter, to get my staff ready for next quarter, to prepare a product plan for 12 months from now? And the actionable side of that often is, let me think about a different world. Let me think about it where this product dominates, or where this thing is easy to get, or where everyone understands that. And then let me back off to what we got. And that's the actionable items that I have found most useful in dealing with assessment, in dealing with that what next question.
Very good. This next question, I think we can all sympathize with. We've all been there. How can one deal with a research article being rejected multiple times?
First off is saying, bless your heart, dearie. It is hard, and in particular, when it's something that you think you have done. Couple of things that happens. If you're down to a thing where you've gone the second rejection, because we all have said, oh, we're going to get this thing in transactions on computers, and got that shot down. And then we said, but there's an Elsevier journal that'll take it. And then that got shot down. It's often useful at that point to bring in someone and have them sit down. Associate editors of journals have tremendous incentives to write reviews that get rejections to go away. And that means they're writing reviews that aren't very improving it. As editor-in-chief of Computer, I wanted very sure that I left everyone with an idea of what they could do with their article and where they might go and what they might need to do to get it there. But that's the incentives are not there for most people. And that means you need to talk with someone about how do you get it to go somewhere else. You need a mentor who has published, who knows these things, who can look at it and give you another perception of it. One of the most common problems that I found in looking at people's articles and helping them was that the articles started in a way that was confusing. The problem from the method from the result. And the swirl of what was happening in those first paragraphs echoed throughout the rest of the article And it was very difficult to tell what was new, what was useful, where one could go from this. And that problem is almost always best solved by sitting down and working with someone and saying, can you give me feedback as to what's wrong here? When you get feedback from journals, of course, that say this has been published before, or that this is not sufficiently rigorous for our journal, or it's missing the point, those are dealing with sort of internal things. And sometimes those present obvious problems that can be solved and things that you can correct. When you're having a long-term thing, it's often an indication that the article is a bit confusing to the reader, and you need someone to help you sort it out, to figure out how to make it communicate clearly to the group you're discussing, that you're using their language, their concepts, you're solving their problems, and you're leaving them with opportunities that fit into their community. And that means you almost always need to talk to someone.
Very good, thank you. This next question is, I love the wording of it, but at the base of it, I think it's an important point in which they're trying to figure out how to get the best work out of you that you can. So they ask, any suggestions how the rest of us can have Einstein's 1905 year with 4 important papers?
Oh, that we could have 4 important papers in 1 year. That year of his 4 papers, jumping at the end of the day to general relativity through the photovoltaic effect and everything else, came to him, after a fair amount of pondering ideas and getting started. And as I recall, he was in the Berne Patent Office at that time, so he really wasn't working in a lab. One of the things that points to is the need for reflection and the need for play and the need for being able to take an idea and push it and see if you can get a broad set of ramifications. In academics, we're very much under pressure right now to have multiple papers a year, and certainly multiple papers on the conference paper level, and even 2 papers at the transactions level. And that in many ways undermines that opportunity to reflect, to play, to work. And that to me is more than anything else the process that gets you to it. I've been working on this book now for some time, and I'm under no pressure to publish, and I'm very grateful for that. And what it's allowed me to do is to write up stuff and then go back to it and say, I didn't quite get it all there. I need to expand in this direction. I need to add this to it. I need to do these following things to make it really worthwhile. And that opportunity to ponder, to play, to I've often thought that you don't really understand a field until you've written 3 articles on it. And the ability to write 3 articles with no deadline pressure, yet in a fairly short time frame, where you kind of rotate among them and see how the different problems feed off each other, can be very, very useful. And that would be my recommendation. No, not very practical one, though.
Thank you. Definitely Einstein wouldn't have been in a lab, because there used to be an old physics joke that if you ever had any problems in your lab, then that means a theoretician must have come into town. So he certainly wouldn't be anywhere near a lab.
No, and I do think that those came out during his year in the patent office.
Yes, they did. This next question says, please comment on conferences which are attached to a primary exposition. My example is the International Machine Tool Show, which is mostly an exhibition or exposition with a small conference in parallel.
Yeah, that's usually an indication of the maturity of the field. When conferences grow, a very common model, but not exclusive model, is that they are started amongst a group of people trying to develop or share a common interest, and exhibits are not part of it. There was an extended period I was part of the Winter Simulation Conference, and it tended to have two equal-sized groups of, about 50 each. One group of academics and one group of, you can call them consultants. They were people who were practitioners who were developing new ways of working on computers. And as it grew, that expanded for a while, and then products came out, and then the products became the major part. And step by step, the academic part faded away, and then the teaching and practice side became systematized. That's not necessarily the case in all. I was the Computer Society's representative to the RFID conference, and that was a case of a conference that had a large industry already, and they were beginning to realize that they needed some new information and some new ideas to help develop and expand the industry and to expand applications. I think in both cases, though, you're in situations where you've got a mature technology. Products, by their very nature, indicate mature technology. And the contributions of the academic or writing is largely there to help support that. Now, it can have an important educational part, and sometimes there are conferences where there are strong theoretical components that are still being developed. But mostly it's an indication that a field is matured, that many, necessarily all things have been answered, and what you are doing is refining and improving a technology.
Thank you. We are running a little bit long, and I don't want to keep you too long, but if you don't mind, maybe we'll take 2 more questions.
No, that would be lovely. I don't want to impose on the audience any further. But I'm glad to take questions as long as there are questions to take.
There are lots of questions. I don't think we'll ever finish these questions, to tell you the truth. But
okay.
This next question is, could you comment on some authors' obsession with journals' impact factors when deciding where to submit an article?
Well, that's really the obsession of deans on impact factors. I have grave doubts about impact factors as an editor. I think they, one, don't always measure what they purport to measure. 2, that they're little too easily to be gained. And 3, they don't help authors very much. And they don't help authors because for a writer, the most important thing is to get your material into the hands of people who can use it. And particularly in doing the work I've been doing for Computer this year, it is very clear to me that there are, in effect, 2 kinds of citations. And you can see these in Explore, in the IEEE library. You can click on any article and you can see the list of articles within the IEEE and outside the IEEE that cite the article. And as you go through them, you can see that there are articles that clearly use the ideas and engage it. And there are articles that are citing it because they need an article on that subject, and they don't care which one. That one has the word in the title, and they're citing it. And so that the influence on being passed from one article to another, in that case, is almost 0. I mean, that's one of the reasons computer articles tend to get fairly high impact factors, because they often are closer to surveys, give more general information, and people can use them to get basic ideas for articles that have nothing to do with it. I don't think it's a good idea to base your things on impact factors. I find the people who advertise that to be, well, kind of bless their hearts, if that's what they think is important, good, but it really doesn't measure the quality of their work. The important thing for any author, and for you, is to get your work in the hands of people who can understand it, who can develop it, who can give you feedback and give you ideas to build it upon. And that's one of the great benefits of conferences. you generally find exactly that community. And if you're not finding it at a conference, you move on to another one. I think that's important. And it's important when you move into transactions to be looking for the same sort of thing. You are looking for a community that helps you, helps the idea, because that kind of interaction helps the community as a whole.
Very good. This last question has actually come up quite a few times from different audience members, so I'd definitely like to hit it. This person says, I recently published in short letters with 6 pages or less limit. They also have impact factors. How are letters different from journals and proceedings?
In theory, letters are quick refereed, short papers, short turnarounds. The idea behind them, and this is coming from my time as Vice President of Publications, is that they get ideas out very, very quickly, and they connect authors to their peers that might not otherwise see it. That a letters journal covers a broad range of topics with very short papers, and that they are widely read. I think in practice that's a little bit less true. That certainly in the Computer Society, the refereeing time has crept up to that of magazines, and magazine refereeing times are notorious for their length of time. But in theory, it's supposed to be faster, and I think there are journals that do that. The physics letters have a reputation for being that way. Architecture letters in the Computer Society has. It is a good periodical. It does tend to have, though, a broader scope, and broad scopes tend to lessen impact factors despite what people say, because you have, in effect, a less concentrated group of people reading it, and it's harder for them to necessarily find it. I think one of the best examples is in the communications of the ACM. They put now research in the back, and this is a great idea in that they are highlighting some good work. However, they go from topic to topic to topic, and so there's not a continuity of themes and ideas and methodologies there. So if you don't see it when it comes out, it's easy to miss it later on, because it's not viewed as a place of having specific areas and specific topics. So it's the trade-off there. Letters do have breadth, they do have speed, and in theory, they're supposed to be advertising your work to a broader community.
Thank you. And Dr. Greer, in general, thank you very much for your presentation today. It was great. We've really enjoyed it.
Thank
I'd
you.
also like to take
very great. Go.
I'd also like to take a moment to thank all of those people who have attended. Our next Distinguished Lecturer Webinar Series webinar will be on the 15th of January at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and that will be on an operational recovery framework for cyber resilience. That'll be presented by Kirill Onwubiko, Director and Enterprise Security Architecture at Pearson PLC, and Director of Artificial Intelligence, Blockchain, and Cybersecurity at Research Series Limited. We have recently added the Standards webinar series. The next webinar in this series is the IEEE 802 Networking Standards, Connecting the World, Part 1, and that'll be at 11 o'clock on the 14th of December. In our Build Your Career webinar series, we'll have our next webinar on the 17th of December at 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time on Solutions Thinking 101, and that'll be presented by Elsa Velasco-Paul, co-founder of the M&E Group. Registration is now open, and we will be sending you a link to these future events along with the slides and recording of this webinar. Again, Dr. Greer, thank you very much. It's been great having you talk.
Thank you very much.